Hello everybody, back with another video about Syria again. Hope everyone is doing good out there, and today I'm going to be focusing mainly on the latest US propaganda stunt in support of Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria, as you can see from the title of my most recent article. And you can see the photo there, that's Ambassador to the UN, Kelly Craft, posing with the white helmets, the infamous white helmet actors. So we're going to get into that, exposing the propaganda. I have to say, the Western Empire really must be desperate at this point. If the way they're continuing to try to defend their proxy armies, the Al-Qaeda in Syria, in Idlib, and the terrorists are continuing to get crushed by the Syrian army, despite the Turkish invasion, which is ongoing, really hasn't done much. So they're getting really desperate, it would seem like, and with desperation comes, desperate propaganda stunts. So here we go. In the latest propaganda stunt in support of the Western-backed jihadist terrorists in Syria, on Tuesday, I believe that would be March 3rd, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Kelly Craft, along with U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, David Satterfield, and the U.S. Envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, they all made a visit to the Syrian border with Turkey at a border crossing into Idlib. Idlib being, quote, the largest Al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11, unquote, which is being slowly eroded and destroyed by a Russian-backed Syrian offensive to liberate the province from Turkish and jihadist occupation. That quote about the largest Al-Qaeda safe haven is Brett McGurk, I believe, back in 2017. He was the anti-ISIS U.S. envoy, and we'll get more into him. Talk about that quote a little bit later, along with some other quotes by U.S. military officials that, expose the U.S. narrative. It's funny how that works. So, obviously, for anyone who's familiar with the situation, U.S. and Turkey obviously oppose the destruction of their terrorist armies in Idlib because they're their proxy armies. It's the Idlib being northwest Syria, where tens of thousands, some estimate close to around 100,000 fighters, majority of them radical jihadists, are making their last stand in Syria. They've been making their last stand in Syria there for about 2 years, ever since the rest of the country was liberated in 2018, early 2018. Of course, is fully backed by the Turkish military, which has, at this point, officially, invaded. You can see here my latest video on that. It's called Operation Spring Shield. The link to this article with all the related links will be in the comments below, as well as this video. So, it's not going so well, despite over 4,000 Turkish soldiers have, at this point, invaded, along with hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment, dozens of man-pads, handheld anti-air missile launchers, U.S.-made, of course, have also been supplied. Despite that, they haven't been able to achieve one single lasting military victory. Strange. So I talk more about the whole Turkish operation in this video here. If you oppose Turkish support of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and you oppose Turkish invasion of Syria, Idlib is legitimate sovereign Syria territory, so they have no right going in, and Syria has made it clear that they're not welcome, and they're there anyway. They're also in Afrin and other parts of northwest Syria, which they also invaded illegally. So if you oppose that, and you have a YouTube account, feel free to head on over to this video and give it a thumbs up. It's doing quite well for me ever since I was YouTube channel banned in Parkland because, if you're familiar with the situation, there was a certain character you weren't allowed to even mention his name, or you would get video strikes. And long story short, I got kicked off YouTube because I was talking about too much truth about Parkland, or rather exposing too many lies, and I was quickly bumped off YouTube. I've had this channel ever since, but I've never been able to get videos have any views. I'm quite certain it has to do with algorithms and that I've been made a target. It's usually what happens when you get kicked off YouTube and make a new channel. If you didn't have much of a following, it's just impossible to get back up there. So in any event, video's doing the best of any video I've had since Parkland. It's gotten over 360 views, which I know is not that many. Even when I was small, back in my successful channel, I was still getting thousands of views on my Parkland videos. So it's come under heavy, this video has come under heavy attack by the trolls. Despite the many likes, I think I've got 13 likes on it, but I've also got 14 dislikes and lots of comments basically just saying to stop lying about Turkey. And I'm not lying, I'm just reporting the truth. I mean, it's open. It's been admitted by multiple U.S. officials that Turkey supports the terrorists. It's no secret. It's not misinformation. I'm sorry if there's Turkish citizens out there that don't like hearing it. I don't like hearing that my government supports ISIS, but it's true, and I'm about reporting the truth. Of course, question everything yourself. Don't just believe me. But anyway, if you support that sort of thing and don't support Erdogan's crazy invasion of Syria and his goals to try to make a new Ottoman Empire caliphate, then feel free to go give that video some support. Maybe get my channel a little bit bigger. Anyway, moving on, I just wanted to add that because I've also been seeing on Twitter that a lot of people have been mentioning this, that the pro-Turkish trolls have just been the craziest and the absolute worst about trolling. And I've seen that too. So I want to throw that out there. For some reason, the pro-Turkish trolls just seem to really be coming in heavy on this Idlib thing. Anyway, moving on. The terrorists, they keep getting pushed back. They've launched several counteroffensive to take back the key city of Sarakib there on the M4, M5 highway after it was taken back by the Syrian army on Monday morning. They've failed multiple times. So with that as the context, the U.S. has so far declined to oblige the Turkish request to offer air support or delivery of its Patriot anti-air missile defense system to Turkey, but they are more than willing to offer their public diplomatic support to the Turkish invaders, and especially the radical jihadist terrorists that are currently illegally occupying Idlib, while the imperialist corporate media is also more than willing to continue pushing the deceptive propaganda, namely that they are rebels supporting civilians. So here we can see Ambassador Kelly Craft. She was so proud of this little propaganda stunt that she pinned her tweet of the event. So here she writes, "Grateful to shake the hands of the brave men and women of the white helmets. These are ordinary people doing extraordinary things to save the lives of Syrian victims of Assad's brutality. America stands with Syria Civil Defense." It's what they call themselves, of course, but they stole the name from the original True Syria Civil Defense, which always stood with all Syrian civilians and not just the ones that just so happened to be under the terrorist occupation. It's a funny thing about the white helmets. They follow the terrorists everywhere they go. Whenever a territory gets taken back by Syria and liberated, all the civilians tend to, stay. But the white helmets flee with the terrorist Idlib. So it's just interesting that the white helmets, they'll only work with the terrorists. They never work anywhere else. They're supposed to be humanitarian and care only about the civilians, but they only seem to care about civilians in the occupied territories. And the interesting thing about that is in the occupied territories, the civilians, of course, are being oppressed and murdered, oftentimes kidnapped, having their organs forcibly taken out and trafficked. All of this going on by the jihadists. So it just a little bit of what goes on with the white helmets. Rather than posing with the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist leaders themselves, as John McCain had often been so willing to do. I don't know if you've seen the photos, but John McCain loved, I don't know how many times he did it, but there's quite a few photos. He did photo ops posing with Al-Qaeda leaders, FSA leaders, so on and so forth. Instead, Kelly Craft took it upon herself to pose with the jihadist frontman propagandists, the White Helmets, where she announced that the U.S. would be supplying the terrorist-occupied region with $108 million in humanitarian aid. So here we can go, here we go to Secretary Pompeo. We lie, we cheat, we steal. Pompeo, his official announcement on that $108 million, just so you can see. He says America is proud to announce additional $108 million in humanitarian assistance to meet the needs of the Syrian people, both inside Syria and the region, in response to the crisis caused by the Assad regime, Russian and Iranian forces. Of course, it wasn't caused by the terrorists who invaded the country, backed by the U.S., CIA, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. It wasn't the terrorists who started this war. Therefore, it's not the terrorists who caused the crisis. No, Assad somehow started the war because he decided to defend himself, defend his country when he was invaded by these foreign-backed terrorists. Funny how the liars and thieves and cheaters like Pompeo never want to take that into account, that this was all started by a foreign-backed regime change invasion. He goes on to say, when the Assad regime, backed by Moscow and Tehran, he always has to point that out. It's not, and he never says Syria either. He always says the Assad regime. It's part of the propaganda. They paint Assad as this crazy, horrible dictator, and they aren't willing to call it the Syrian regime, let alone the Syrian nation or Syrian country. Turkish, of course, he'll never call it the Turkish regime, even though that's more aptly fitting. Anyway, he says, it imperils millions of Syrians. America responds by upholding our deep tradition of generosity in humanitarian assistance. You gotta love that. Deep tradition of generosity in humanitarian assistance. Of course, the assistance goes almost exclusively to the terrorists, and we have a very, very deep tradition of supporting violent revolutions, attempted overthrows, coups, terrorist invasions. Look at Libya, look at Syria, so on and so forth. Venezuela, it's just over and over and over. That's what the deep tradition of generosity. It's a deep tradition of generosity towards pretty much anyone willing to take up arms against countries that we claim are ruled by dictators in order to overthrow them. So that's the $108 million in humanitarian aid. Just wanted to show the official announcement by Mr. Pompeo. Back to Kelly Craft and the actual, stunt itself. It is unclear if Kelly Craft is ignorant or simply chooses to ignore the fact that these so-called humanitarian rescue workers are in fact jihadist organ traffickers and child kidnappers, and admittedly the quote-unquote brothers of Al-Qaeda in Syria. That's no joke. We'll get to that in a second. When Kelly Craft describes what she calls these brave men and women as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, she is lying to us or completely ignorant. Unless she considers jihadist fighters to be ordinary, and the extraordinary things she's talking about is staging false flag chemical attacks and other propaganda stunts, such as this one right here, fighting the Syrian army alongside Al-Qaeda and aiding and abetting the same terrorists who habitually oppress and murder the Syrian civilian population. So here we go. Here's some photos just in case you are unaware of this. This is not crazy conspiracy theories. There's a video from 2015, I believe that's in Idlib. There's a White Helmet member holding an assault rifle. This is a really pretty famous one. Most people have seen this one, but there's a whole video of, the White Helmet there. You can see waving an Al-Qaeda flag, and Al-Qaeda right next to him. That's also in Idlib. There we have White Helmet, wearing the costume and the assault rifle, brandishing it with the jihadist fighters right there. Part-time White Helmet, full-time jihadist. And then there's another one. In this one, he's not carrying the rifle while he has the patch on, but same guy. And there's many, many more photos of these. I've covered many of them. There's a White Helmet also participated in the beheading of a 12-year-old Palestinian, Abdul Isa. They slowly cut his head off. I'm not going to show the pictures here. I don't want to get the video removed, but gruesome. It was really they cut his throat really, really slowly, really horrible. And this White Helmet just proudly waving the head when they finally get it cut off in the public square. And there's so much video footage. If you go to my the link here to this post, you'll see at the bottom of the post there'll be a in-depth video, I believe, from Clarity of Signal. He's got a great website. He's done a lot more than I have exposing the White Helmets. But a long video full of evidence like this, just one White Helmet after another. Pictures even while they have their little costumes on with guns, or helping the Al-Qaeda, carry the dead bodies of Syrian soldiers and stuff like that. Or sometimes it's just showing that, matching up, like this last photo here, matching up photos from when they are without the costume fighting, and then when they have the costume doing their propaganda stunts. So there's a lot of evidence on that. It's not a conspiracy theory whatsoever. The real conspiracy theory is that these are humanitarian aid rescue workers. And it's interesting and worth noting that their costumes are Western costumes. They're made by the UK, I believe. So that's just all part of the Western support of the terrorists. So anyway, now there's tons of that evidence. But even worse, there is the Idlib White Helmets leader himself, the leader of the White Helmets. He called Al-Qaeda and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is formerly al-Nusra, or Al-Qaeda in Syria, he called them my brothers, at a ceremony put on by the terrorists themselves in Idlib to honor this quote-unquote humanitarian organization. So again, you'll be able to watch this video clip if you go. I'm not going to play it here, but this is the quote he says on the stage of the ceremony. "I would like to thank my brothers in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham for this honoring ceremony and all those who participated in organizing this event." And in the lead up to this, they're announcing that they're basically honoring their brothers in arms. So it goes both ways. They know, they consider each other their brothers. This is no secret. At the ceremony, as he walked up onto the stage, he also kissed both al-Muhaisini, can be seen in the photo below there, the screenshot, as well as the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leader, Abu Jaber. Al-Masini is a Saudi Arabian Salafist terrorist leader who has been designated as an official terrorist by the U.S. Reuters describes him as, quote, one of the best-known jihadists currently fighting in Syria. He is a member of the Sharia Council for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an alliance of jihadist rebel factions. You gotta love how they, even as they're describing terrorists here, they call them a jihadist rebel faction. That's just crazy. Anyway, these rebel factions include the Nusra Front, a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., and they're still calling it a rebel faction, a former Al-Qaeda, they even admit it themselves, a former Al-Qaeda group which Saudi Arabia and its allies accuse Qatar of funding. Reuters wrote. You just gotta love how they still, within the same sentence that they describe Nusra as Al-Qaeda, they call it a rebel faction. It really, really blows your mind. And it just shows that they know that they're terrorists, and they still choose to call them rebels. At least in some cases, they're not ignorant. HTS is also a designated terrorist group according to the U.S., described by the State Department as the current Al-Qaeda branch operating in Syria. Here's the official announcement, the media note from the State Department's website amendment to the terrorist designations of al-Nusra Front, straight from the Department of State. It says, the Department of State has amended the designation of al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, to include Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other aliases. These aliases have been added to al-Nusra Front's designations as a foreign terrorist organization under Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, blah, blah, blah. It goes on to say, the coordinator for counterterrorism, Ambassador Nathan A. Sales, noted that, quote, today's designation serves notice that the United States is not fooled by this al-Qaeda affiliate's attempt to rebrand itself. Whatever name Nusra chooses, we will continue to deny it the resources it seeks to further its violent cause, unquote. So they themselves, the State Department itself, has stated publicly and officially that this is an attempt to rebrand itself to avoid the designation of terrorist. It hasn't worked. It hasn't fooled anybody. Although the media and U.S. officials will continue to deny it, even though the government itself, right there, says they're not going to be fooled. However, this claim to deny it the resources it seeks apparently excludes funding of its brothers in arms in the White Helmets, to whom Trump authorized an additional $4.5 million in October of 2019. You can see a screenshot from the Washington Times. Trump doles out $4.5 million to White Helmets in Syria, money aimed at protecting ethnic religious minorities amid conflict. It's very, very ironic that it says the money is supposed to go to protect the ethnic and religious minorities, because those are the people that are the most brutally oppressed by the jihadists in Idlib. Interesting how that works. Furthermore, it should be noted that in every liberated area of Syria formerly occupied by the jihadists, such as Ghouta, Douma, all those areas, even Aleppo, the White Helmet centers are always located in the immediate vicinity of al-Nusra headquarters and outposts, most often right next door to them. Sometimes these White Helmet centers even contain military equipment inside them, or like shells, empty shells, stuff like that. Humanitarian aid provided to the White Helmets always ends up being used to treat al-Qaeda and affiliated terrorist fighters in their field hospitals, where Turkish and U.S.-supplied medical and food supplies are being found throughout Idlib. This is documented by Vanessa Beeley, who's currently there right now. She's been reporting on this, findings like this going on every day now. In southern Syria, Israeli medical supplies were more commonly found abandoned by the terrorists and White Helmets. Israel also treated the terrorists in the occupied Golan Heights in their own field hospitals, Israeli field hospitals. Israel later evacuated hundreds of besieged White Helmets from southern Syria, alongside FSA commanders and ISIS terrorists. And also, I highly recommend reading this article. It's a really, really long piece by Vanessa Beeley. She interviewed a White Helmet who chose not to go to Idlib with the rest of them. They settled with the government. They were fine. The whole claim by the White Helmets is they were scared they were going to get assassinated, get slaughtered by Assad, dictator, if they stayed, but that's not true. As long as they laid down their arms, they were allowed to go back to a normal life, and so there were actually some White Helmets that stayed, and he was the White Helmets leader that decided to stay, and instead of going to Idlib and continuing to wage the jihad, he stayed behind, and he claimed he was never allied with the al-Qaeda terrorists, but he did admit that in al-Qaeda occupied or controlled territory, then it's most likely that the White Helmets would be al-Qaeda. So Idlib, al-Qaeda controlled territory, White Helmets are going to be, al-Qaeda. In any event, he said eyewitness testimonies from that very area where the evacuation happened. He said many Islamic State terrorists fled alongside the White Helmets. So eyewitness testimony from an insider who was there when it happened. He said everyone knows it. She also tracked them the towns they went through as they went from their front line to the border region where Israel took them out. So highly recommend clicking on that link right there. It just goes through so much other stuff. So like I mentioned, she's been doing a lot of on the ground stuff. British journalist Vanessa Beeley. Here's a video. She talks about this ongoing stuff, and she talks about a lot of the stuff she's been uncovering, just like the White Helmet centers. And here's actually a statue, a White Helmet statue. Looks like a pretty permanent statue they built. And this was in an Al-Qaeda occupied area. So how is it that, they're going to allow a White Helmet statue to be built unless they're aligned, affiliated ideologically on the same page? Of course they are. They call each other brothers in arms. These connections between U.S. designated terrorist groups, high-level jihadist leaders, and the White Helmets organizations in Idlib doesn't seem to bother Kelly Craft or her U.S. associates in the slightest. But it did catch the attention of some Twitter users who call out her blatant support for al-Qaeda in Syria. There were a lot of supporters, but there were also a lot of people calling her out. So here's just one for an example. You are shaking the hand of people who shook the hands of some of the most indescribable scum that ever walked the earth, Miss Craft. This is one of the most successful propaganda facilitation groups ever constructed. Their mission to promote and continue the West's regime change. And that's so on point. It is unclear who exactly the humanitarian aid will be delivered to, the 108 million. Probably not going to go directly to the displaced civilians. I'm guessing it's going to go via the White Helmets. It's interesting that it was announced as she was shaking hands with the White Helmets. But in any event, it's likely going to be funneled to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham fighters. In the past, most humanitarian aid designated for the civilians in the terrorist-controlled territory instead ends up in the hands of the terrorists, who hoard it while starving the civilian population. This is according to numerous civilian testimonies who lived under this terrorist occupation. They rarely, if ever, see any portion of this aid. Even if it starts out going to the civilians, the terrorists just come in and seize it, and then they charge exorbitant rates for the civilians to get the food that's being given freely. Well, not really freely. It costs the taxpayer lots and lots of money. But so it's unlikely that this whole big other part of the propaganda stunt, this huge amount of aid, is going to even end up in the civilian. It's not going to probably feed them or clothe them. It's all going to go to the terrorists, more than likely. I'm not saying for a fact, but that's how it's gone in the past, so it's likely how it's going to go in this case. Of course, the Western corporate media propaganda outlets don't report on this or on any of the White Helmet connections. Of course they don't. But they only continue to this day to describe the al-Qaeda-occupied Idlib as rebel territory. And you can see here ABC News tweet on this story. Another picture of good old Kelly Craft. Says she makes a historic visit to Syrian rebel territory and announces the 100 million of U.S. assistance for food, shelter, winter clothing, medical care, and safe drinking water. The food is no doubt going to end up in the hands of the terrorists. The medical care probably going to end up treating terrorist fighters, so on and so forth. But we'll see. Once it gets liberated, we'll get all the stories from all the civilians that had to survive through this. We'll get the straight story eventually. But most likely it's going to be just like all the other occupied territories where the terrorists hoard everything and the White Helmets are pretty much used to funnel the stuff in. Anyway, it's not just ABC News. All the mainstream medias continue labeling them as rebels, opposition, moderate, claiming Assad's brutal dictator, even though he's the one fighting the terrorists. But not only is it even just the media, it's also the U.S. envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey. He's described these U.S. designated terrorists as the Syrian opposition. This is what he said during this propaganda stunt, standing on the border of Syria. On those hills over there, the Turkish military and the Syrian opposition are first of all fighting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, said James Jeffrey, while visiting a refugee camp near Turkey's border with the war-battered country. And they're not first of all fighting for their own survival. No, they're fighting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, says this joker. He goes on, millions and millions of refugees. That's the intent of Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies. Yeah, because that's all that Syria and Russia and Iran want. They only want to create refugees. They're not actually fighting to get rid of these terrorists. They're not fighting to reclaim sovereign Syrian territory, put it back in the hands of the legitimate Syrian government. You can call Assad a dictator all you want. He's still internationally recognized as the presidential elected president of a country that has sovereign rights over all its territory. It's a UN member nation. So you call him a dictator or not, it doesn't really matter. Turkey, Erdogan is a dictator. There's a lot of dictators, and the U.S. supports a lot of them. It doesn't mean that they don't have territorial integrity over all of their own territory. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't defend an invasion from a foreign country, whether or not that country claims to be fighting for freedom or fighting to establish a caliphate or fighting to steal resources. It really doesn't matter. Countries tend to defend themselves. Governments tend to defend their countries against foreign invasions. Whether you support that government or not is really irrelevant to the propaganda being spewed here. Clearly, that is not what Assad wants. He doesn't want millions of refugees. He wants the refugees to come back to Syria. That's what he wants. That's why Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies have set up multiple civilian corridors in Idlib for the civilians to come back into government-controlled Syria, but the terrorists won't allow them. They shell them, they plant mines along the roads, they snipe them, and in some cases when they're feeling really, really nice, they allow them to go out, but they charge them exorbitant rates of money that no one can afford, so really they can't go out. So in any event, they can only go one direction, towards Turkey. It's the terrorists backed by Turkey that have manufactured the refugee crisis. And there's not millions and millions. That's just absolutely a lie. Well, I guess millions and millions, that could be, no, that more than 1 million and more than 1 million would be 4 million at a minimum. Millions meaning at least 2, and millions meaning at least 2. No, that's not true. Even the biggest, most exaggerated numbers still only say 3 million. That's not millions and millions. That's just millions. I'm sorry, James Jeffrey. It's really ridiculous, the propaganda, and it's really have no way of knowing how many millions of refugees there are at this moment, but Russia claims they could be undercutting the numbers, just like the West is exaggerating, but it's probably somewhere in the middle. Tend to be how these go, but they claim there's only tens of thousands of refugees, and they claim they've been tracking the movement of refugees with their surveillance drones. So who knows? I'm guessing the numbers are closer to maybe 200,000 than 1 to 2 million that they're claiming. But millions and millions, it's not even possible. There's not that many millions of people in Idlib. And to say that that's the intent of Assad is it's so contrary to what's actually going on. The intent of Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies are to win a war against foreign-backed jihadist terrorists. That's the intent. Yes, there are going to be civilian refugees. That's the nature of war. Who started the war? The terrorists started the war when they invaded. The U.S. started the war with the CIA operation, Timber Sycamore, when they started funding them and training them and dumping them in. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Qatar, Turkey, they all started the war when they started dumping their hired fighters into Syria to overthrow Assad. But it gets worse. James Jeffrey also made sure everybody knew that despite refusing to offer air support or Patriot air defense systems to Turkey thus far, that might change, the U.S. does still support the illegal Turkish invasion of Syria in defense of these U.S.-designated al-Qaeda terrorists, and he said the U.S. was willing to sell munitions to Turkey in support of the cause. The strange thing is that this same U.S. official works for the presidential administration of Donald Trump, who himself previously exposed the fraudulent deception of these terrorists being called rebels. So here you can see a tweet from Donald Trump back in 2013. The terrorists in Syria are calling themselves rebels and getting away with it because our leaders are so completely stupid. Yeah, like James Jeffrey. It's almost like he's speaking directly to people within his own administration. Funny how that works. He's changed his tune a little bit now that he got elected and he's part of the machine, but still, U.S. president. This is what he said before he became president. Maybe people should listen. They're calling themselves rebels and getting away with it. And it's so true. For those who are unwilling to believe this truth coming from Trump, maybe because he's a Republican and you're not, and he's a liar and you trust other people more than Trump, I don't blame you. Well, here's a Democratic presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard. She also exposes the fraud and calls out the media and the government officials for supporting terrorists by falsely describing them as rebels. I'm not going to play the clip, but in the clip, she quotes two U.S. officials. The first one is Brett McGurk, who I quoted at the beginning. He served as the U.S. anti-ISIS envoy in both the Obama and Trump administrations. So he served under both a Democratic and a Republican administration, and he called Idlib the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11. He also described it as a big problem, a problem that Russia-backed Syrian forces are currently solving, much to the dismay of U.S. and Turkish leadership, which are showing themselves to be the ultimate champions of the very same radical jihadists that their own countries have officially designated as illegal terrorist groups. The second U.S. official who makes Tulsi's case for her is U.S. coalition spokesman Colonel Miles Kagan, who said in an interview with Sky News that, quote, Idlib province seems to be a magnet for terrorist groups, especially because it is ungoverned space in many ways. There are a variety of groups there. All of them are a nuisance, a menace, and a threat to the civilians. Let me repeat that. There are a variety of groups there. In other words, there are a variety of armed groups there. He's not calling them all terrorists. He's just saying there are a variety of groups there. All of them are a nuisance, a menace, and a threat to the civilians. The hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who are just trying to make it through the winter and are searching for hope and a will to survive. That's just, there's no misunderstanding that. There are a variety of groups there, and all of them are a threat to the civilians. So that just completely unravels everything that this James Jeffrey dude's been saying. Funny how they're both spokespeople for the same government. Funny how that works. Interesting. People still think that they're not liars, you know? It's crazy. Now, what James Jeffrey said in late 2018, even a little more absurd than what he's saying right now. At that time, the Syrian army was also gearing up for a wide-scale military operation to liberate Idlib. That operation, due to numerous Turkish brokered ceasefires, was postponed until December of 2019, and that's when the current operation that's still ongoing started. Mainly because the jihadists never adhered to the terms of the ceasefire and always kept firing on Syrian army and civilians, and so the Syrian army was always forced to, take the terrorists down, and then, of course, Turkey would jump in and, oh no, we stop violation, we need to broker a new ceasefire, and on this would go. But at the end of last year, that's when Syrian army had enough. They said, no more ceasefires, this is done, and so that's when the big, large-scale offensive finally kicked off. It took a whole year from when it was originally planned to start, but it was inevitable I mean, which one of other countries in the world would allow to have a huge portion of their country? Imagine if the U.S. had Texas was filled with Al-Qaeda, and those Al-Qaeda terrorists were consistently, on a daily, weekly basis, shelling the neighboring states, shelling like New Mexico, Oklahoma, and whatnot. And then any time that police or the U.S. military tried to take out the terrorists in Texas, Mexico would jump in and be like, no, you can't do that. They deserve their own sovereign. We need a ceasefire. They deserve a sovereign state. They're fighting for democracy. It's insane. No other country would allow it. It's only because Syria's the so-called bad guy, according to the U.S. empire. That's the only reason that these characters can say the things they say with a straight face, is because they hate Syria. There's no other reason. No other state is held to such standards as Syria that they must allow internationally recognized terrorists to control a section and have its own state, basically an Al-Qaeda state within the greater country of Syria. It's quite nonsense. But anyway, back then, when they were about to do what they're currently doing now, he went ballistic, and on September 7th, 2018, he said, "They're not terrorists, but people fighting a civil war against a brutal dictator." So, nothing new. This propaganda has been going on for years, and it'll probably keep going on until the terrorists are completely gone. And then there'll just be a new wave of propaganda built up around whatever new narrative they come up with. Not much has changed between then and now, except that now Syria has successfully liberated an entire third of this final terrorist stronghold in the country. It has done this in the face of a full-blown US-backed Turkish invasion of Syria. In the process, in the recently liberated territory in northwestern Syria around Idlib and Aleppo, even more evidence has been uncovered, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Idlib is being run by radical Al-Qaeda terrorists and ideologically aligned jihadist allies, not moderate rebels, as the liar James Jeffrey, Mike Pompeo, New York Times, so on, so forth, all claim. It's all lies. Jihadist slogans and flags, along with white helmet symbols, are being found all across the recently liberated territory. Here's just one example from Fariz Shabi, a Syrian member of parliament. This was from February 14th, when they had just recently liberated all of Aleppo for the first time. He says, "My message today to all those idiots who still think there is a rebellion in Syria. What is this big Al-Qaeda sign doing at the main international highway entrance of Aleppo? This area was liberated only days ago, and this sign is a solid proof of who was here for 8 years. And you can, of course, try to deny that. Like, I've had people comment on my last video exposing Turkey's support for the terrorists. They say things like, oh, it's not an Al-Qaeda flag, it's a jihadist flag. Potato, they're terrorists. It's a jihadist flag. Al-Qaeda's jihadists. So, yeah, it is a jihadist flag. It's an Al-Qaeda jihadist flag. It might not be the official Al-Qaeda flag, but it says the same thing that the Al-Qaeda flag says. It's the Syrian Al-Qaeda flag. So, and it's not just the only one. There's been all sorts of similar flags, slogans painted all over liberated areas. You can't shave your beard and things like that. Vanessa Beeley's been collected quite a few of the flags. Follow Vanessa Beeley. She has stuff up on her YouTube channel and her Twitter, so she's got more evidence there. If you're looking for, even if you're not convinced thus far, go over to Vanessa Beeley and you'll see even more jihadist flags. Some of them Al-Qaeda, like this one, some not so much. The deception and the hypocrisy could not be more obvious, and as can be seen, the nonsensical propaganda is easily exposed as blatant deception from within the ranks of the very same government from which it is spewed. The Western Empire is losing its war on Syria, both militarily, as its proxy armies on the ground in Syria are being absolutely, utterly destroyed, and diplomatically, as the lies and hypocrisy continue to be more and more easily seen, further exposed by new evidence coming forward every day. That right there is just one tiny piece of that new evidence that's coming forward every day. Anyway, here's another video I put at the end. It's a Tapestry of Terror. It exposes the white helmets by Clarity of Signal. Highly recommended. So links will be in the description below. Hope you all enjoy the information. If you appreciate, please give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe. Till next time, this has been Jason. Peace.
Civilians inside Idlib are actually encouraging and helping and enabling the liberation of the towns in Idlib by giving the Syrian Arab army information and intelligence, so they know exactly where to hit, which is not to hit civilian areas and to hit the areas where the terrorists